Good morning. I wonder if that's going to catch every breath that I have today. Um, yeah, I was asked to come share a little bit. I'm not planning on having this be very long, partially because I was a little bit struggling with something to come up with, and I also didn't have a ton of time this week to come up with it. But so I decided, as I often do when someone asks me to present something and I struggle coming up with ideas, I stole them from someone else. And so recently I've been reading through a book, and it's called The Life You've Always Wanted, Spiritual Disciplines for Ordinary People by John Ortberg. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. It's kind of it's a book on spiritual disciplines, but it's a really kind of like interesting take through. And I remember even like a couple years back, I think about like 2 years ago or so, I went down to Harrisburg, Oregon for their youth rally, and I actually like preached a sermon on spiritual disciplines, because that was like the theme of the youth retreat. And so going into this book, I was like, oh, I probably know a lot of what he's going to talk about, but I was actually pleasantly surprised, and I remember like reading some of this book, and I was like, man, I kind of wish I had have known and read this book before I preached that sermon. I probably would have taken a slightly different angle, or I would have included some things from this book that I think are really really nice and really beneficial. And so so I'm just gonna kind of hopefully over like, I'm gonna try and cap myself at like 20 minutes. Going just over what's basically chapter 3 of this book, that calls Training versus Trying. And it's just kind of in this chapter, he kind of lays out like a general understanding of the spiritual disciplines before, in the remaining chapters, he then goes through some specific ones and how to apply them. But I think that this chapter is really kind of the, what he establishes in this chapter can, even without the remaining chapters, is worth hearing. Oftentimes, if you're like me and if you're like the author of this book, he describes the tension between like going to church, hearing a sermon, like say on patience, and you're saying, and then like feeling convicted and saying like, yeah, you know what, I'm not a very patient person. Like I should be more patient with like, and so then you go home and you're determined to be more patient, and you're like, okay. And then Monday morning rolls around and your kids are being little nightmares, or that annoying coworker, or whatever situation comes up, and then you just realize like it immediately just goes out the window, and you're like, and you just lose all of your patience, and you're right back to where you were, and you're like, I tried so hard to be patient, but it just didn't work. What he talks about, he tells like this long story kind of as a metaphor. He talks about how basically like imagine like some like government like really like high up science board came to you and said, hey, like we've done like genetic and like everything, like studies on every single person in the United States, and we're looking for like someone who can run the fastest marathon. And they're like, and we've studied everyone, and we have decided that it is you. You have like all of the characteristics, you have all the potential to be able to run like this marathon at world record pace or something like that. And he was saying like, he was like, wow, that would be amazing, because he was like, well, like that's incredible. Like I would never have thought that I was capable of that. And so he's talking about like, you might get excited, and goes like, but at some point the realization of the fact that that you currently cannot run a marathon is going to set in. Like I would wager that probably like none of us in here, if we tried, like if we just like walked outside here and we had our running shoes and shorts on, and we just said like, all right, let's go run 26 miles. I don't think probably any of us would be able to successfully do that, let alone do it well. And so he says oftentimes we spend most of our efforts trying to be like Jesus. He goes, and a lot of times we have about the same levels of success as if we were to just step outside and go try to run a marathon. He goes, so we go and we try to be patient, and then life happens, and then we end up very much so the same as we do with the marathon, exhausted and defeated. And so then from there he goes into saying, spiritual transformation is not necessarily a matter of trying harder, but training wisely. He brings up the verse that a lot of people are familiar with when we talk about spiritual disciplines, which is 1 Corinthians 9:25 and 26. It's Paul talking about, he says, everyone who enters the Olympic Games goes into strict training. They do it for a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. And, we've always known, like Paul saying, like, okay, like, here's the thing, like, you've set out on this journey to be Christ-like, and it's a journey, it's a lifelong, process of transformation. Saying, like, you should treat it like the people who enter the Olympic Games, like they go into strict training. It kind of becomes, in a sense, their life. They gear their life towards this training. And then he kind of follows it up with a kind of an interesting point that I hadn't really thought before. But a lot of times when we hear that, we're like, wow, that sounds really difficult. Like that sounds like a lot of work, like all of this training. And then he just said like this line. He goes like, we often think that trying that it's easier. Like wow, that training is all that hard work. I'm just gonna try my best. And what he gives like this little analogy, and he goes like, yeah, you would think that would be easier, just to try your best rather than training. And he goes like, but if your goal was to like play a Bach sonata or something on the piano, like he's saying like, he goes, in fact, the easy way is to spend time sitting down at the piano and practicing your scales and building up the technique and practicing the piece to be able to do it. He goes like, it's significantly harder to just sit down in a concert hall in front of people, not knowing how to play the piano at all, and then try to play a sonata or any piece by Bach. And so, and I read that and I was like, oh yeah, that does kind of make sense. Like, well, okay, yeah, we can spend, we can say like, oh, we're just going to try our best, and when we'll find that we'll fall short in the areas that we always fall short in. When in actuality, sometimes the easier thing is taking the small steps and creating the habits and implementing these spiritual disciplines in order to train ourselves. So he gives kind of a line of kind of like his definition for following Jesus. He says, following Jesus simply means learning from him how to arrange my life around activities that enable me to live in the fruit of the Spirit. So then he goes through and he has a lot of clarifying points, and so he goes through a section of saying well, okay, so before we talk about what spiritual disciplines are, he goes let's talk about what spiritual disciplines are not. He goes, the first one that he says, he goes they are not a barometer of spirituality. He goes it's not you're not going out and it's oh well, I read my Bible every day, or I spend I fast X amount of times a month or a week or a year, or it's like we're not aiming to impress God or people. It's not that. He says like a true indicator of spiritual well-being is, are you growing in the ability to love God and to love people? Because if you're growing in that area, and say if day by day you are more able to love God and more able to love people, then it is a better indicator of your spiritual well-being than how often oh well, how many times did you fast this month? It's like, well, maybe not, and maybe not at all, but we look at for instance, like the Pharisees, who had very strict and rigid schedules, and they had all these disciplines and all these practices, and yet it did not yield the results that God was looking for, which was loving people. It created a very religious and legalistic kind of superiority and hierarchy, where we feel better because we're trying to look better and look more righteous than other people. In a sense, we're saying, we're trying to impress God, or we're trying to impress people. And what he says too is that the spiritual disciplines are tools. He says basketball players don't get any points for how many free throws they made in practice. These spiritual disciplines are not ends unto themselves. They are the means of achieving ends. The other thing that he says that spiritual disciplines are not, is they're not necessarily unpleasant. He says disciplines are defined by the target of the training. He goes so if your target is that you want to run a marathon, your training and your disciplines are probably going to involve exercise and strength training and endurance training. However, if you want to enter a pie eating contest, a lot of your training is going to be eating pie, which many of us would argue is a rather enjoyable experience. And so then he just makes the point. He goes if our goal is to live a life of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, if all these things, if that is our goal, then we shouldn't be surprised if some of the disciplines are going to be rather pleasant. He then kind of finishes that section by saying there's some of you who struggle with joy, you might be overwhelmed to hear that the spiritual discipline of celebration, that just taking the practice to, when good things happen, take a moment and celebrate them. And you'd be surprised at how much joy and gratitude those things will produce in your life, just by taking the habit of, when something happens, I'm going to celebrate it. So then he goes and answers a couple questions. He goes okay, so what makes something a discipline? Not necessarily a spiritual discipline, but just a discipline. And so he gives the definition. He says, any activity that I can do by direct effort that will help me do what I cannot do now by direct effort. So any activity I can do by direct effort that will help me do what I cannot do now by direct effort. He talks about just the idea of willpower. And again, going back to this whole trying thing, he tells a cute little story about two frogs who bake some cookies, and they're eating them. They're oh, we got to stop eating these cookies. And so they start brainstorming all these ideas that they could do. And they're well, we could tie it up in a box and put a string on it, or we could put it up on top of the refrigerator, or we could go hide it. We could put it up in a tree. We could do all these things. And each time when they come up with an idea, they say well, yeah, but we could just go untie the box, or we could just go climb the tree and get it back down. They each method they come up with, they say hey, no matter what we do, we want to eat the cookies, and we can find a way. And so eventually one of the frogs just takes it and throws them all on the ground and says, hey, birds, cookies. And so then the birds come and they eat all, and he goes now we have no cookies. Look at that. And he goes but we have a lot of willpower. And the other frog says, and he was like, well, you can keep your willpower. I'm going to go home and bake a cake. And it just kind of, it's a cute little funny story, but it illustrates the idea that willpower can only accomplish so much. And part of the reasons that these spiritual disciplines that disciplines in general are valuable is because they allow us to do things that willpower alone cannot accomplish. He uses the example of Alcoholics Anonymous. He goes, and he says, the first of the 12 steps is acknowledging that, I cannot stop drinking by willpower alone. He goes, and so, therefore, I must arrange my life around a set of practices or disciplines that will help me do what I cannot by trying hard. So he's saying, in that respect, Alcoholics Anonymous is training for sobriety. The point being that, in many ways, we can benefit from the ideology and the methodology of Alcoholics Anonymous. If there's an area of our life that we say, hey, I could use improvement in this, and trying harder is just not yielding results, acknowledging that and saying, okay, maybe I need to put in some practices, maybe I need to put in some things to assist me. The next question that he answers, and he was like, okay, well, what is a disciplined person? He defines it as someone who can do the right thing at the right time in the right way with the right spirit. And I brought this point back a little bit earlier, but he talks again about, this is when he talks about the Pharisees. Again, it's they had all of these disciplines in place, yet they yielded no results because they could not do the right thing at the right time in the right way with the right spirit. Which is why Jesus often butted heads with them, because they were we have all of these things and we have everything together. But when Jesus said yeah, but can't you see that this is the right thing to do? Are you unable to see that? Are you unable to do that? And it was just kind of the idea that it's not about mastering the disciplines or the practices themselves. Again, you can go back to, you can practice free throws until you make 1,000 in a row and you never miss. You can become a 99.99% free throw shooter. It doesn't mean a lot if it doesn't carry over into a game. And just in the same way that a lot of our personal, spiritual disciplines and practices, they don't necessarily mean a whole lot if our lives look no different, and if we're not, able to love God, and if we're not able to love people. Because we can do a lot of things, but as it says, man looks to the outward appearance and looks to the things that you're doing, but God looks at the heart. And if we're not making if our hearts are not being transformed, then we're likely training ineffectively. And so he says, it's not about mastering the practice, but being someone with discernment who can discern when laughter or gentleness or silence or healing words is called for, and then offers it promptly, effectively, and lovingly. Next question is, how can we tell if we're on the right course? He's saying and this is the point where he brings back, and he's saying, because often the thing with spiritual disciplines is that we recognize that we are unable to bring about change in and of ourselves. It's not something that we can engineer and manufacture. So he's saying we can be open to the transformation through spiritual disciplines, but we can't force it. He gives an illustration of a motorboat versus a sailboat. And he's saying like a motorboat, you can, put in the water, you can fill it with gas, you can turn it on, you can pilot it and drive it, and you are in control of the whole thing. That boat will go wherever you tell it to at your control. you are, and he's saying, like, you are totally in control. And he's saying, like, that's not how these work. He goes, like we as people who are led by the Spirit are more like a sailboat. We can put up the sails and we can open ourselves to that transformation, but where we go is going to take the discernment of saying, well, where is the wind blowing? Like, where is the Spirit moving, and how can I move in that direction and utilize that? He says, he uses the story of Moses as kind of an example, and he says, like, and he goes, like, God's job is to provide the burning bush. Our job is to turn aside to it. So then, not much longer here, but then he kind of goes into kind of well, how can we know what spiritual disciplines like we personally need to practice? And he's saying, like, you almost have to kind of like work backwards, saying, like, well, first you need to understand, like, well, what does it mean to live like Jesus and to live as part of his kingdom and part of the family of God? And then once you kind of have an understanding of, like, okay, well, what does it look like to live the life that Jesus is calling you to? Then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what barriers are there that are keeping us from doing that? Maybe it's a devil chicken. And then what practices, experiences, or relationships will help us in overcoming these barriers? He gives, he talks about the example that he had that was just, he was saying, like, he was like, I know that I should be loving. He was like, because what I've discovered, is that loving requires a lot of energy. And sometimes I am too tired, or I do not have the energy to give in order to love well. And so he was saying, it's like, one of the things that he had to learn was that he had to implement the spiritual discipline of sleep, which sounds kind of silly. You would say, like, well, how could sleep be a spiritual discipline? But in the context of saying, okay, well, if my goal is that I want to love people, and I find that my barrier is that I'm too tired and I don't have the energy, perhaps the solution is, well, how can I get more energy in order to be able to love well? And he was like, well, have I been neglecting my sleep? And so in some of and he says later, I don't have it written down, but he was saying, like, he was like, for some of you reading this book, perhaps the greatest, like, thing that you could do, like, right now is to set down this book and take a nap. But the whole point of him kind of like going through this thing is that saying, like, a lot of times we split off and we like say we like to create a box and say, like, well, spiritual disciplines are these 12, like, or like this many type of exercises, and it's only things like reading your Bible, fasting, prayer, quiet time, or like silence, or like all these things. And like, so we say, like, and like anything outside of that is not a spiritual discipline. He instead, suggests that, like, hey, going back to his definition of what is a discipline, it's an activity that I can do that will help me do what I cannot do now by direct effort. And so if I can't love someone right now because I'm tired, sleep is an activity that I can do that will help restore my patience and restore my energy and restore my ability to love well. And then the other thing that I liked is that he was saying, like, if you, like, one of the things that you can do that'll help, it's like he splits kind of, he's saying, like, in general we can divide kind of like, different like sins into kind of like two categories, like sins of omission versus sins of commission. He's saying, like, the sins that you do and the sins for things that you didn't do and that you should have done. And so he basically says that, like, if you find yourself in a routine of doing something that you, like, if you are doing something that you should not be doing, perhaps finding a spiritual discipline that implements restraint would be a good tool. So he's saying, like, maybe for you, fasting might be like something, like the idea of that, like if you are trying to train yourself in the ability to resist things, maybe you can start with a fast or a silence or with, like, withholding something. It was like, or if you struggle with not doing things that you should be doing, then he's saying, like, okay, maybe do a spiritual discipline of like we talked about, like celebration, where it's like, okay, I'm going to intentionally do things that are going to bring about change in me. So just kind of in closing here, the general encouragement is that if there are areas in your life that you feel as though you are trying really hard and getting frustrated, not seeing results, my encouragement is that perhaps you weren't meant to be trying so much, where maybe training would be more beneficial. Going back to kind of the definition of following Jesus that he gives earlier, and I think in a lot of ways we try to make things very complicated when at the end of the day we end up losing sight of the simple things by getting into all the details of like all these things, when the definition they says, he goes, following Jesus simply means learning from him how to arrange my life around activities that enable me to live in the fruit of the Spirit, living a life of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And then I just wanted to kind of close with a verse, Matthew 11:28. Just says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Let's pray. Dear God, I just ask that you would just help us and show us today the areas that we need working on. God, in the areas that, would you bring to mind the areas that we've been just like trying really hard that we need to change our tactic, God? And would you begin to show us the simple things, God, that we can do to be more like you and to be more loving and to reflect the character of Jesus more, God. We just ask that you would just give us a mindfulness as we go about our lives, God, and that we would just be able to be a beacon of light to a world that needs love more than ever. We ask that you would just do all these things and protect us as we go. We thank you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.